Welcome back. You're watching Credlin. Ahead of the 2014 Victorian state election, the Labor Party used almost $400,000 of taxpayers' money, your money, to pay electorate staff to do political campaign work for the ALP. It became known as the Red Shirts Affair after the campaigning gear that these staff wore. Despite the Victorian Ombudsman finding as many as 23 Labor MPs were involved, the Victoria Police investigation into the Rort was shut down in 2019. Now it turns out Victoria Police detectives wanted to arrest and prosecute as many as 16 Labor MPs, were secretly overruled, though, by senior officers. Documents obtained by the Age newspaper show high-ranking officers instructed the detectives not to arrest, photograph or search any of the Labor MPs in relation to this affair. For his reaction, I'm joined from Melbourne by the Shadow Police Minister, Victorian Liberal MP Brad Batten. Brad, I started the show with this issue and I likened it very much to the Fitzgerald-era corruption we saw in Queensland, this whole muddiness about this affair and the need now, I think, to be a real investigation into what's gone wrong or what's transpired here. You're a former police officer. Justice is supposed to be blind, not party political. So what happened here?
Yeah, I think there's many questions, Peter, that have been raised, particularly from that Age article today, which has specifically said there was, potentially interference in the process of what should happen. No person in Victoria should ever be above the law. And I call on every person, when you've been investigated, to cooperate with the authorities. We know that Daniel Andrews loves to get in front of the cameras and say, I take responsibility for everything under the government I lead. And he also follows it up with myself and my team will always cooperate with authorities. What we've seen now is when the cameras are off, he effectively says to his staff and his colleagues to shut up and stay out of it. We need to make sure that there's no interference. We have to have confidence in the government of the day that they're not going through a process to rort money from Victorians. This Labor government has a history of it. We've seen it with a speaker, a deputy speaker. We've seen people travelling with dogs in their cars to travel to their houses across Victoria. This is the key of it. And it came out in IBAC, where it wasn't just $388,000. Adam Somriek has made the allegation that it was $500,000 on record when he was in IBAC. So Daniel Andrews has to explain, number one, where's the other $122,000? And number two, like when you pay a speeding fine, when you pay the money back, that is an admission of guilt in my view. And Daniel Andrews needs to explain that to all Victorians.
I know some people will say, compared to the rounding errors of government in the millions of dollars, $400,000 isn't a big deal. But I think the principle of, as the allegation is, police interfering with detectives' work, senior official police, interfering with the work of detectives. The good thing in all of this is that there were detectives who thought that the book should have been thrown at some of these MPs, but the interference of senior officials, as the allegation is, I think that's incredibly disturbing. But this is not the first instance with Victoria Police. We know about Lawyer X. We know that was heavily considered, the issue of corruption there in the Royal Commission. Special investigator has now just been appointed to pursue whether or not there should be criminal prosecutions. We know about Cardinal Pell. That went all the way to the High Court and 7-zip, overturning the Victorian conviction. Now, obviously, this information out today. If nothing else, there needs to be a Royal Commission so Victoria Police can deal with the bad apples and clear its name, because there's a cloud over Victoria Police now that is difficult to remove unless there is a serious investigation.
Yeah, I think you hit it very much at the start there when you spoke about the figures and the difference between $388,000 and we talk about billions in cost overruns. There's a difference between incompetence and corruption, and we need to make sure that any allegations of corruption, no matter how big or small, have a formal investigation. And the government at the moment, as we know, we've heard quite regularly, they've withdrawn funding from IBAC. They've reduced the amount of funding that's available for IBAC to operate. And now we're starting to see, I guess, why you would make sure that they've got not enough money to investigate thoroughly. Adam Somriek has gone in there and made huge allegations against his government. But then when it was endorsed effectively with the article in The Age that said there's detectives within the Victoria Police, and most of the Victoria Police are pretty good people, they wanted to follow it through. If senior management have been involved in for that, I want to know some questions from the government. Why did senior management get involved? Was there any influence from external people? And I say to Shane Patton, who's the current Chief Commissioner, that you've got a great opportunity right now to ensure that the Victoria Police gets the respect back and has an investigation with proper oversight. You need to take responsibility to ensure that that happens. You need to make sure that the investigation is reopened. You need to make sure there's absolute and utter independent oversight of this, and that those that wanted to follow through with the charges are given the ability to follow through with the charges, or at bare minimum, put the interviews to those people that should have been interviewed. When I was in the police force, we would interview people. You have a right to silence. Therefore, you can have a right to say no comment. But you had the process and the allegations put to you, and that hasn't happened. It just feels like it was not due process. And we need to make sure there was no political interference. We had a former Chief Commissioner. The new Chief Commissioner now has an opportunity to correct that and make sure we can have confidence in the investigation into the Labor government.
We know that following the commentary from Adam Somyurek, not commentary, it's evidence, the evidence from Adam Somyurek at IBAC, there's been calls for the Premier to face IBAC. The Commissioner of IBAC, Robert Redlick QC, he's spoken about the constraints on IBAC's powers, making it very difficult, he says, to call witnesses to give evidence in public hearings. Let's have a listen.
In 2020, over objection by IBAC, further amendments were made to the IBAC Act, which introduced a significant further restriction on IBAC's ability to hold public examinations. For IBAC to compel someone to appear as a witness in a public examination, IBAC must also be satisfied that a public examination can only take place where the subject of the investigation constitutes serious corrupt conduct or systemic corrupt conduct.
So the very government we're asking IBAC to investigate and pursue potentially on these allegations made by one of their own former ministers about corruption, the same government we're asking to be investigated or looked at more closely is the same government that voted to constrain the powers of IBAC. And that's the difficulty we've got.
Yeah, and that puts huge pressure. And I feel sorry for IBAC, who would probably want to go through with formal investigations with every person to ensure that the evidence is put on the table. But the government have done everything they can to block anything that they've done over the past, we're going to say 7 years now since they've been in Parliament. We've already seen at the start of the the start of the red shirts, Rorts, we actually had a process where the Victorian government moved to actually get spent, $1 million of government's money to stop the Ombudsman report coming out. And now we see them where they've reduced funding for IBAC, but worse still, they've changed the rules so it makes it more and more difficult for members of Parliament to be investigated. IBAC is there to stop, and as he said, systemic or serious misconduct, systemic or serious corruption. If stealing $388,000 of taxpayers' money to run your own campaign is not serious misconduct or serious corruption, I don't know what is. We need to make sure that we can get to the bottom of this and have faith in our system. The biggest worry for me is so many people out there see what's going on and you hear it in the street, and I'm sure, Peter, and you and all your staff have heard it, but all MPs are the same. We're not. And as long as they can continue to get away with it, people will have that perception that we are all the same. We need to make sure that those who are doing this are accountable and no longer remain in the Victorian Parliament. Our Parliament must be protected. It's too important to have it sitting there above all of our heads whilst we go through not just elections, take elections out of it, why it goes through something so dangerous with the pandemic legislation coming through. I want people to have confidence we're doing the right thing, we're the right people, and as long as Daniel Andrews and his government continue to hide what's going on, there is this perception across the community that they interfere in the investigations and they're going to cause us issues for all.
Look, just on that pandemic legislation, the Prime Minister weighed in on it this morning. Let's have a listen.
I have concerns that governments are continuing to want to be involved more and more in people's lives.
What about this legislation, Prime Minister?
That's what I'm concerned about. Well, look, I'm always respectful of the Federation, Neil. I work with all the premiers and chief ministers, but the clear message about it is this: your call, your responsibility.
You're not willing to criticise this legislation?
Well, I'm not a Victorian, one, and I'm not in the Victorian Parliament, and I'm not the Victorian Premier, and I'm not the Victorian Leader of the Opposition. They should all do their jobs, and I'm going to keep doing mine.
So I don't think the Prime Minister is signalling he's got any interest to override the legislation. I know Amanda Stoker, who's in the AG's portfolio in Canberra, said on this show probably 10 days ago that was something that the federal government could do if it was of a mind, meaning it all comes down to the crossbench, I suspect now, Brad.
Yeah, it's going to come down to the crossbench, and we are serious in what we're saying with this. We have serious concerns. So do many QCs and solicitors who have signed up to say that there's faults in this legislation, and we have genuine concern. I would never bring in legislation I don't trust someone in the future with. That is what this legislation is. It takes away too many rights. People want less government in their lives and not more, and I will continue to campaign to try and stop this legislation going through.
Brad Batten, thank you for your time. There he is, Victorian Shadow Police.